All right, everybody, welcome to TYT Interviews. We've got another great interview for you guys today. Daniel Weeks, Executive Director of Open Democracy and the author of Democracy and Poverty, A View from Below, joins us. Dan, welcome to the Young Turks. How you doing, brother?
Doing great. Thank you for having me, Cenk.
No problem. I see that you're starting a rebellion because there's a sign behind you that says New Hampshire Rebellion. Are you in New Hampshire, and what kind of rebellion are you starting?
I most certainly am. New Hampshire is my home state, and we are starting a citizens' rebellion against big money politics. The basic idea that government is meant to work for us, we the people, but it ain't. And the only way that we can respond, having tried the regular course of interventions in Washington, is to get citizens mobilized, literally walking the talk for reform of big money politics. And so this rebellion has been marching in all seasons across the state, from all corners of the state to our capital in Concord. And we are mobilizing citizens to join this cause of rebelling against big money politics, especially with the 2016 presidential elections now underway.
How does this work, Dan? How do we rebel? I assume it involves pitchforks.
Well, pitchforks may well be required down the road. We're going to give our political leaders the benefit of the doubt for now. We're going to be peaceful, law-abiding. We are going to key off of the principles that make our country great, rebelling in the tradition of our founding fathers who, yes, eventually they had to use violent means. We sure hope that that's never in the cards for us. But they started by protesting, by putting themselves out there, by sending their petitions, by ultimately writing and signing the Declaration of Independence, putting their lives, their fortunes, their honor on the line. And we think the system we have today is one of systemic corruption, where big money effectively dominates our political process. And it requires that citizens do as our forefathers did by leaving our homes, by taking to the streets peacefully again, spreading the message far and wide, and taking it directly to those people who would be our leaders, the candidates for president who are flocking to New Hampshire these days, and demanding that they commit to reforming big money in politics as their first priority in office.
Yeah, well, I did my part because I took a bottle of Snapple Ice Tea and I threw it in the water and I said, "Take that, British." Okay, but I
appreciate you doing your part.
Yeah. Perhaps I had the wrong target, though. It's not really the British we're concerned about at this point. It's more the donors are coming. The donors are coming, right?
That's right.
So in the context of what's happening in New Hampshire, both on the Republican and Democratic side, are you guys trying to get people to go to town hall events or whatever people are putting together and get up in Hillary Clinton and Bernie Sanders and Rand Paul's grill and say, hey, what are you guys going to do to fix the system?
That's exactly what we're doing. We have hundreds of citizens who've signed up to, as we call it, bird dog the candidates. That means going out to the campaign events, and there are literally dozens of events happening every week with several candidates in the state. And we have the chance in New Hampshire. We're pretty spoiled, to be honest, when it comes to politics, the level of exposure we have to the future president. So we send citizens out, we train them, we give them questions, we track the candidate responses, we video and audio record their statements and put them online and share them with the media. And we challenge citizens to ask one basic question of the candidates at every stop. That is, what specific reforms will you advance to end the corrupting influence of money in politics? And some of them have been given pretty good answers. Some of them have been holding off, but at least all of them are acknowledging that this is a problem that we have to address. And we think that's the first step to getting them to actually commit to solutions.
Dan, we're all pretty aware that bird dogging sounds pretty dirty, right?
Sometimes you got to get in the mud.
Yeah. Okay. Oh, man. Oof. Then we started bird dogging. There's no way that sentence ends well. Okay. So has anybody had a good answer so far? Has anybody said, oh, but dude, I'm on it, man. Here's step A, B, and C. And at the end, boom, money's out of politics.
You know, we've been encouraged. Granted, there's a long way for many of them to go, but take one issue like a constitutional amendment to deal with Citizens United, the disastrous ruling 5 years ago that opened the floodgates to unlimited spending in elections. That is often been seen as a liberal issue, although I've always believed, in talking to the conservative and independent friends as well as progressive friends in New Hampshire, that it actually cuts across the aisle when you talk about what ordinary citizens think about money in politics and Citizens United. But the Republican national leadership has so far withheld coming out in support of such an amendment. That changed several weeks ago when one of our bird doggers was out at an event and asked Senator Lindsey Graham what would he do to stop this corrupting influence of money in politics. And he said that we need to amend the Constitution to overturn Citizens United. Happily, not long after, Hillary Clinton came out and in fact, on her first day as an official candidate, she declared that we need to overturn Citizens United through a constitutional amendment and through appointing Supreme Court justices who would change that jurisprudence. We've seen the other Democratic candidates do so, and we've seen other Republicans come close. I can't say that they've definitely committed, but as far as this big reform, which people used to say no national Republican would get behind, that's not true anymore. And other reforms, transparency is something that all of the candidates have called for so far. Citizen-funded elections, we've heard some candidate interest, and we hope to hear more. So they are moving, and it's a testimony to the fact that if you're willing to get out there and bird dog these candidates, eventually they'll have to listen.
Well, if anybody's going to get bird dogged, it's definitely Lindsey Graham. So I'm encouraged to see that it actually had an effect and that you guys got people on the record for it. And I had seen that Lindsey Graham story. I didn't know that it was one of your guys that had asked him that question. So that's actually super positive. And I love that they're on the record for a constitutional amendment as not only the host of the Young Turks, but the founder of Wolfpack. Obviously, I'm massively in favor of a constitutional amendment. I think that's the right way to go. But I'm going to press you a little further on it. It's easy for Hillary Clinton or even Lindsey Graham to say, sure, yeah, I'm in favor of a constitutional amendment. Yeah, but what are they going to do about it? Did they ever answer that question?
Well, I think the first step, we've concluded after I've spent some years banging my head against the wall of Congress trying to get them to take a proactive approach in reforming this system, and it hasn't worked, to be honest. We've concluded that the only promise we have of addressing this systemic corruption is if we get citizens to make it not just one of a dozen issues that get talked about, but the first primary voting issue for citizens. And we find that everybody agrees it's a problem. Our polls suggest 96% of the public think money's having a corrupting influence on politics, and I haven't found anyone in that remaining 4%. But at the same time, most people have very little hope that can be solved. And I think that's exactly what you're getting at in your question, which is we need to show the candidates that this is actually a voting issue and that it's in their self-interest if they want to get elected to take the right stand. Thus, getting out not once or twice, but literally every stop they make in New Hampshire, and getting our friends in Iowa to do the same, where similar bird dogging efforts are underway. I think that is the way the candidates will begin to see that if they want to win this primary, they've got to get on the right side of this issue. And we're starting to see that movement.
Now, all of a sudden, we've talked about bird dogging so much, I'm wondering if I should try bird dogging.
I highly recommend it. You're welcome to New Hampshire anytime.
It went from sounding dirty to sounding kind of fun. Okay, so, all right, one more thing about this. How is OpenDemocracy, who you're the executive director of, related to the New Hampshire Rebellion?
The New Hampshire Rebellion is our flagship campaign. It's a movement that was started by Harvard Law professor Lawrence Lessig, who you know, who you've had on the show, who's become a remarkable national voice on money and politics issues. He's been leading the walks, all 200 miles across the state in the dead of winter, and other walks throughout the year. And the Rebellion is a campaign really conceived around the presidential primary. We think this is the best moment we've had in years to force this issue onto the national agenda. So we're putting all the power we have in mobilizing other groups to do the same to build this Rebellion campaign through New Hampshire's primary next February.
Yeah, I went on one of the walks. Instead of walking around 4th of July like you guys just did, I had the genius move of walking in the winter. And here's what I found out about Larry Lessig. That dude's a fast walker, man.
He moves.
Like, we walked like 18 miles that day, of which I think I was with him for about a mile and a half. And then, like, by the end, they had to scrape me up off the ground. Meanwhile, he'd, like, gotten his coffee or hot cocoa, like, hours ago when he checked in. You guys got to slow down for the rest of us, man. I mean, if
during those cold winter days, we'd be sure and have the RV going along. So anybody who needs a bit of a rest and some hot chocolate, we've got a place for them.
All right. So we got to do walking together. We got to do bird dogging together. And then the last part is taking a bus ride together, because that's apparently what you did. That's the story behind your new book. And I found that fascinating. So you went around the country spending $16 a day. I literally don't know how you did that. I guess to feel the shoe on the other foot, to see how people in poverty live. So tell me a little bit more about that journey, and then I want to find out what you learned through it.
Sure. Well, the motivation for this peculiar journey, where I rode around through 30 states, some 10,000 miles on Greyhound bus, keeping a poverty line budget of $16 a day. The idea for that was, after spending several years trying to get campaign finance reform passed in Washington, it occurred to me that the fight really was outside of Washington, and the people really paying the price were not one side or the other in Washington. Sure, one side wins the election, the other side tries to raise more money and come back, but this really wasn't about Washington fundamentally. It was about real human beings paying a real price for this corruption of our government. We start off with the idea all men and women are created equal. Government derives its authority from the consent of the governed. But in actual reality, we have not just a few, but in fact 50 million Americans just about who are officially poor, another 100 million Americans, adding up to about half our total population, who are just a few paychecks above the poverty line. And these folks are paying a real price for this corruption of our democracy in Washington. And I wanted to meet some more real people. I consider myself a real person, but once you've spent a while working on Capitol Hill, you do get a bit disconnected. And so by keeping this poverty line budget, one thing it forced me to do was to sleep in strange and sometimes uncomfortable places. I never knew quite where I was going to sleep. Either it was on a bus or in a bus station, or on a bench on Capitol Hill, or outside the White House, or in far-flung corners of this country, in a shelter in Skid Row, Los Angeles, in a trailer in the desert in New Mexico, one of these unincorporated colonias, down in the lower Ninth Ward of New Orleans. As a matter of fact, over those extensive travels, not once did I feel actually unsafe. It was remarkable to me how gracious people were and how willing people were to speak. When I would put questions to them like, do you feel like you have a voice in politics? Do you feel like you're represented? People were pretty ready to speak about just how disenfranchised they felt. There is a huge sense of alienation from the political system, of hopelessness that their needs could ever be addressed, as well as a bunch of just practical barriers that people face to exercising the franchise. I realize that the money in politics matters a whole lot, but even before you think about how we fund campaigns, people's ability to just go out and vote in the first place, or to participate in other ways, is severely limited if they're worrying about where they're going to get their next meal, or where they're going to sleep that night, or if, God forbid, they have a criminal record, and in a lot of states they're disenfranchised for the rest of their life, even if they never set foot in prison.
And if you're homeless, you literally don't have a utility bill to go and put with your address so that you can go in and register. I literally don't know how the homeless vote, if they can even vote at all. And the poor vote at a disproportionately low percentage, right, Dan?
It's the gap is staggering in the degree of representation. So a low-income person is less than half as likely to vote in a presidential election as wealthier people. A third is likely to vote in other elections, midterm elections, for example. And when it comes to more costly forms of political participation, and voting is costly enough for a lot of people, getting time off work, getting yourself registered if you don't have a license, or if you're moving constantly to keep a roof over your head. But when it comes to funding campaigns, in fact, it's no surprise low-income people don't account for any of the money that funds political campaigns, that decides who can run for office in the first place and what issues they stand for. In fact, in the 2012 election, the last presidential election, a single individual, Sheldon Adelson, provided more money in politics than 98% of the population combined.
Isn't that amazing? Let's pause on that. One guy, a casino magnate, which, I was told that gambling was immoral by an earlier generation of Republicans. Fascinating. Anyway, had a louder voice than 98% of the country. Is Sheldon Adelson really equal in our democracy? Does he really have the same, they say one man, one vote. Does anybody believe that? That the people that you met on the bus, that they have the same power, the same one vote as Sheldon Adelson does? Can anyone actually say that with a straight face?
Certainly nobody did to me. I mean, to give you one example, a guy I interviewed in Los Angeles, he made a couple mistakes in life, he would freely admit, but probably the biggest mistake he made in life was who he picked for parents, if you will. Mm-hmm. His mother was 17 when he was born. She had dropped out of school, as had most people in the neighborhood attending a failing public school. His father got his third strike for drug-related offenses when he was 4 years old, and hasn't been heard or seen since. And this young man went on to, through some pretty turbulent years, followed his uncle into the business, the only way he could see to get out of poverty, by selling drugs in his neighborhood. And when he was about 12, his uncle, whom he considered like a dad, was shot, and he watched him die. And that kind of shook him up, but this was the only way he knew. And after serving time himself and then being released and actually becoming a father himself, he decided he really needed to straighten himself out. And when I got to interview this young man, he was just one semester away from finishing high school at the age of 22. He was very proud of having made it that far. But what he was grappling with was, it was well and good that he was going to get his high school diploma, and that would mean he was qualified for something maybe a little bit better than working at the fast food restaurant in his neighborhood. But when it came to actually, well, for one, there were no jobs in his neighborhood that were going to pay him much more than that minimum wage job at the fast food restaurant. And so how he was going to support his young kid and his girlfriend was beyond him. But in the course of the year or two before I interviewed him, he'd actually started to get political. He'd met some folks who decided that they actually deserved to have a voice, and had decided that one of the most manly things he could do was actually to fight for child care centers in his neighborhood, high-quality child care, which we know is terribly important to giving kids who are born into multi-generational poverty a better chance in life. And of course, he's thinking of his own kid here, too. But when it came to actually fighting for something that seems pretty basic, opening a couple of child care centers in a part of Los Angeles that is pretty under-resourced and can make you would think, a good claim to such an investment. Honestly, when it came to engaging politicians, he felt pretty hopeless. Most of his friends, the kinds of people that he would want to engage in this effort, had criminal records, and so that made it difficult, if not impossible, to vote. Certainly if they were in prison, they lost the right to vote, and for some time after. Never mind actually thinking about running for office or recruiting someone from their neighborhood to run for office and someone who would really carry their message. So a lot of them couldn't vote because of a criminal record, mostly nonviolent offenses. They certainly couldn't imagine running for office or funding campaigns. And so, again, something that seemed pretty simple, setting up some child care centers, was just the biggest task he could possibly imagine. And he desperately wanted to do this, but didn't really know where to begin, and was on the verge of giving up, according to our interview, just feeling like the attempts he had made had fallen on deaf ears because the politicians didn't really have an incentive to go to him, again, because he wasn't going to provide the money that would fund their campaigns.
A lot of people forget that not everybody lives in the same context and perspective that you do, right? So I happen to grow up in the suburbs in New Jersey, and my parents, I was super lucky, were upper middle class. So when Mitt Romney says, well, if you want to start a business, why don't you just ask your parents for money? Yeah, but that guy doesn't have parents he can ask for money to start a business or a child care center. And he didn't grow up in the context that I did in the suburbs, where everybody assumed that you were going to try to go to an Ivy League school, right? That guy growing up probably never even heard of an Ivy League school. And his entire context was, well, how do you make money? This is how you make money. And then we, as a society, turn around and blame him and say, how dare you do that, right? Instead, what you should do is go flip burgers at McDonald's for the rest of your life. So that's why I think your book is really interesting. I think you're the first person in Washington in decades to actually talk to anyone who's poor. I congratulate you for that, or who's in any way, shape, or form worked in Washington to do that. And just one last thing about that, Dan, it creates a vicious cycle, doesn't it? That the poor are disenfranchised because they feel like they have no voice in politics, because in reality, the politicians aren't really trying to win over voters as much as they're trying to win over donors, because whoever has the more donors has a 95% chance of winning. They're not stupid. They figure that out. They figure if I get the donors like Adelson, I'm all set. I don't really need anyone. I just take all that money, run BS ads, and I win, right? So the poorer voters are acting somewhat rationally. They're right. They don't really have a voice in government, so then that makes them want to vote less. And then honestly, the richer voters are also acting rationally because they do have a voice. The more money they give, the better results they get. So it does make sense for them to vote. So then you set up this vicious cycle where the rich, in a democratic sense, get richer, right? And sometimes in a literal sense, and the poor get poorer.
James Madison, the author of our Constitution, writes in Federalist 51 that Congress is meant to be dependent upon the people alone. And he goes on to say, not the rich more than the poor. We know that there is and always will be economic inequality in this country. And to a certain degree, that is indeed beneficial to a flourishing private sector, and the profit motive does indeed help to produce wealth. But when we allow that economic inequality to become translated into political inequality, not only are we then violating our first principles as a country, the ideas of our Constitution, of our founding fathers, but we are really messing up people's lives. And my ultimate argument in this book, Democracy and Poverty, is that poverty is more than just an economic problem. People who lack means and lack economic opportunity because of the circumstances of their birth, to a much larger degree than we typically acknowledge. And it's not just a social problem, and certainly it matters. Family structure matters, and the social context matters as well. At base, the poverty we see, which again affects nearly 50 million Americans living on less than $6,000 per person per year in a typical family of four, this very real poverty is ultimately a democracy problem. It's because we're allowing, through our system of privately funded campaigns, through a political system that's totally dependent on private money, we're allowing this translation of economic inequality into political equality, which in turn deepens the economic inequality and excludes people. And so just as you say, I'm sorry to agree that it is rational for people to opt out of the political system. For the people I interviewed and spent time with to say, why should I bother? And yet, if we think that poverty is a problem in this country, and if you don't think so, I ask you, anybody watching this, to please spend a little time, go down to your local soup kitchen, speak to some people and hear a little bit about their story and decide for yourself if we can simply blame the individual or if it wasn't something broader, something a little more systemic that contributed to their poverty. So if we accept that poverty is a problem, we have got to make our democracy work, as in everybody has a voice. Money must not decide our politics.
Yeah, and I don't want anybody to walk away with the wrong idea here. I don't want you to disengage. I want you to further engage. And I don't mean that in the traditional sense, like, oh, let's get out there and vote. If it's Hillary at the end, let's vote for Hillary. If it's Jeb, let's vote for Jeb, right? No, I mean get involved in whether it's walking with Dan and Professor Lessig in New Hampshire, whether it's volunteering for Open Democracy, Wolfpack, whatever it might be. Get involved in fixing the system. So don't just wait around for, okay, the donors picked these two schmucks, and I guess I got to vote for one of them, and I got to hold my nose and vote, or I stay at home. That's not the answer. To me, the answer is actually getting down on the ground and finding a way to fix this system. There are very logical ways of doing that, including, of course, we're biased towards Wolfpack. We think we have a way of getting the constitutional amendment. Larry Lessig's literally one of the smartest people in the country. They've got a great fight over there. And please join Dan in Open Democracy and the New Hampshire Rebellion. And remember, guys, they're not bird dogging us anymore. We're bird dogging them. Are you with me, Dan?
Amen to that. Thank you so much.